everyone, welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we're going to talk about how to draw a wren. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here is the wren. They have several different colors. They have like a dark brown, some white, and then this sort of tannish color on their chest. So, I'm going to start with the chest and go from there. You know, just like always, feathers are very similar to fur, and so you can draw them the same way. So intermixing the, staggering the lines the way I would with fur. Sometimes you can distinguish feathers, and sometimes I draw distinctive feathers on a bird, but sometimes I don't, and it still will look like feathers. So now his head's turned, so some of what I'll do is loop these this way, and I mean his body's kind of going that way anyway, but you know, be mindful of the angle that something's looking at it. There is some white mixed in on their chests, but it's much more sporadic. It's mixed into this tannish color, so I may add some bursts of like white in random spots, but don't really need to, so I don't know if I will or not. Still debating. Might be one of those things, you know, you experiment and see how it goes. Experimentation can sometimes lead to really effective details. Now, something I almost didn't do, right, like as their hair comes down, it's going to be coming down in this direction. I almost had it all looping this way, and it's not really going to be accurate. So I'm sort of shifting the direction now. It can be easy to get in that trap where you're just following this line. And while this edge will follow the line, once you get up into here, it's really going to be angling down back between his legs here. And then here, you know, we're going to have just a little bit of gray mixed into here. So I'm going to take the gray of the beak and mix that into the white, and then it really turns white underneath. There's this white strip up here as well. So now up here under the beak, I'm going to loop it so that the feathers are kind of, you know, looping towards the edge instead of following the contour down, like along the back, and even the head a bit. You're following those lines around that contour because you don't have a lot of feathers sticking out. Underneath here, because of the angle of his face, they will kind of be popping out right there. So as I do it, right, I'm bringing that down and looping it so that the line ends there instead of, right, following this down like that, right? I'm coming out like this instead. But that's only because of how his head's turned. If his head were turned a different way, that would not be the case. And then I need to make sure it makes sense as it runs into the other feathers. There's no real differentiation between these white feathers into the tan here. They're both these sort of softer underneath feathers that birds have. It's just a different color, so, you know, try to make that match up. There's a little bit of white spaced out through his body, but we'll add that later. Gonna mix some of the gray in, and then we'll get his beak before we do his darker brown feather color. So what I'm likely gonna do here when I highlight it is highlight the white first and then put the gray on top, just like I am with how I'm sketching it. Because the white's such a powerful color, it'll be easy to moderate the gray as I'm adding that pin pressure. Now, as you bring the feathers down like this, I think it's important not to leave it perfect. Like, you want a few feathers coming off. That's what's going to make it look a little bit more natural. Otherwise, you know, if it's too perfect, if you follow that line perfectly, it's going to look more contrived, right? Like, we expect it to be a little windblown, a little out of place. It also adds a little bit more interest, so you don't want that to be a perfect line. which makes it a little easier, right? You can come off without having to worry about that perfect edge. Now if I do any feathers that are looking more like what we think of as feathers, where you're doing an actual feather design, it would happen on these longer section here along the back. Not really on the heads as much, because they often have these sort of short feathers on the head, and the stomach, because of how they are, they're usually a little different. So if I would do it, this is where you're going to see those big feathers sort of popping in, and where fanning out the strokes can be beneficial, but I often don't do that because you don't really need to. You can create another effect. I've certainly done it before on birds, and there are times where I do it, very subtly here or there, but for the most part you don't need to create that. They also have some black mixed in, which is what this feather is, and then some of this lining here. They have just a lot of these black, almost ribbons running up their tails and on their backs. You won't be able to see it as much on the back because his back's almost turned to us. The little bit of it, that we might see is there. They also have that light buff color in their tail feathers, so we'll mix some of that in as well on the edges. The way we sketch may actually help this ribboning that it has, these little lines, because it won't be this nice straight clean line, right? Like you're going to have this sort of jagged edge to it that may be beneficial to the overall look of the composition than if we were drawing them in perfect definition. And then we have the legs. Oh, and there's also a loop of gray around the face. Now their legs, of course, it's just skin. It's a little bumpy the way that their skin is. Might be interesting to see about adding some bumpiness to the highlights and shadows. All right. So we're going to start with this tan color on his stomach. Light source. I was almost going to do light source from over here. I think that would still work. I was just sort of debating. It's because his head's turned, and if it's coming from in front of, this should still catch. It's just depending on if I want the shadow on this side or if I want it along this side and him looking into the light. Let's have it coming from this way. And as I just mentioned, and what I always mention, right, is it means that's above and in front of, not behind it and not next to it. It's kind of in front of him. And that'll, even though his head's turned this way, because it's above and in front of, this should still be catching the light. What's going to be in shadow is under his beak here, because that'll be turned away, and then along this back side there should be some shadowing. And then of course all edges are in shadow, so even this, side will be in shadow because it's rounding away. But here is where we put the full pin pressure. If I do decide to add in any white over top, it would be, on the gray, so I don't need to worry about not filling in an area. And then as the shadow, as his body comes down, right, you're going to have a deeper and deeper shadow coming in from underneath, because his, body is rounding under, so all of that would shift. So this is all aimed away from that light source. Now the only thing to make sure of, like always, right, as you go into shadow, that it's tapered in nicely. It's not like a hard transition. It's part of why I leave extra shadow for myself, so that I have some flexibility as I bring the highlight down, to making sure I taper it into the shadow without it being too jarring. Oh, Photoshop just froze. Alright. Well, Photoshop froze on me, so here we are, way back here. It's why I have learned to save chronically all the time. Photoshop will do some saves in between, but yeah, sometimes it will not. As you can see, we've backtracked just a little bit, but I had just saved it, so it really did pick up from my last save. But it's a good reminder. Get in the habit of chronically saving things, and you won't have too much work to backtrack on. And you can see it thinks it's recovered. Yes, we want to save. So Photoshop, I guess, had done a save after I was trying to recover that file. And so now I'm just going to be feathering in the highlight to where I want it. Right, so their chests are kind of like a big ball. Very circular. And there's nothing really to interrupt that. So that's just kind of how we would shadow it. Have the highlights until the ball starts rounding away from us. And it doesn't hurt on animals as opposed to a ball. Adding in some highlight into shadowed areas, just where feathers or hair, fur would be catching the light. Just making sure that the highlight is all nice and bright. I'm going to do a little bit more feathering on the bottom there once I brighten this up. There we go. And then I added a little bit of burst right here where his feathers come forward, separate a little bit from his body as, you know, it's attached to his leg there. We're going to get the white. I am holding back my pin pressure just a little bit so that the gray comes through. It might still be too bright. We're going to see. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put this on a different layer. Yeah, I think that shows up. Because it's not a lot. It's just like a little grayish. Really, it has kind of a pattern to it, but I'm not going to really worry as much about how the pattern is because it's so subtle. You can see it, although it's really, it is a bit hard to see. So right under is picking up light, right, because you have the beak that goes in and then it pops back out. So underneath would catch some light before it goes back into shadow. Most of the beak underneath will be in shadow, but just a little bit's catching the light. A lot of these feathers are going to be in shadow, but they will likely be picking up some highlight, especially the edges, right, the edges of those feathers. I'm going to do the whole thing in shadow first, and then I'll add bursts of highlight and create delineations between some feathers. Now I'm adding just a little bit of the tan color to the edge of the tail feathers, because it does, in fact, they do have this sort of tannish popping up. So the reason I'm doing this is I think based on the angle of the light, right? The bird would be blocking some of the highlight onto the tail, but probably not all of it, especially as the tail extends out. So I'm just adding a little burst of light to the tail, and then we'll taper that in. Do a little bit of the same over here, but it's quickly going into shadow. Now I'm just slightly filling these in, but they would be catching highlight. Not fully, because they're tucked under his body a little bit, right? So some of this won't be, but as you get to the foot, certainly would be catching highlight. Now the last thing we have to do is the eye. Still might taper off some of this white a bit, but it is a subtle transition, so maybe I'll leave it. But their eyes are brown. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and use the same brown from their backs. So some of what I was doing, right, they have a little bit of striping happening. Wrens do. As you can see in the tail, there's the black stripes, but there's also, in the dark brown, there can also be some of this buffy color, this tan color, to create the stripes, and then it's the white in the black. So I was doing some of that to add some illusion of striping. And now we're just going to do the eye. Birds, you can often very easily see all the way around their eyes, but we'll still use shadows and highlights to great effect. And so just like always, we'll take the select tool and we'll select out right around the pupil to make sure it's nice and straight. Want it bigger than any of the lines I've drawn. And then we'll just erase it. Right, and from there it's straight enough. Now we'll add the highlights. So like always, right, light source coming in from over here. So therefore, this side of the pupil, as the pupil comes out of the recess, and our eyes would be catching the light. And then this side's actually going to be in shadow against the pupil, but this side of the eye will be in highlight. And then as you come to the edge of the eye, that goes into shadow again. Right, so we're going to have this taper off. And that highlight's going to be all the way underneath. It's going to hit and catch into the highlight that's against the pupil all the way under here. Now we're going to add the light flare, which is one of the most important parts of drawing an eye. We're just going to fill it with the foreground color, which I've already set. Take the select and erase out where I went over the edge. Alright, so that is how you draw a wren. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.